In a tense showdown in Congress, Jasmine Crockett and Marjorie Taylor Greene clashed over LGBTQ+ rights, and more than 3 million people watched it unfold. But this wasn't just a debate. What happened next went far beyond politics. From social media to small towns, from the halls of Congress to the bedrooms of children struggling with who they are, everything began to shift. It was a moment that forced America to look at itself. So what exactly happened in that room? And what did Jasmine Crockett say that left the entire nation speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber felt less like a government building and more like the front lines of a cultural war zone. The walls, lined with oak panels and American flags, couldn't contain the heat radiating from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene as she rose from her seat, fire already loaded in her voice. Cameras zoomed in before she even spoke. "I don't want my child learning about homosexuality in the 3rd grade," she barked, her tone sharp enough to cut steel. She held up a brightly colored children's book with 2 dads on the cover, like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "This is grooming, not education." Her hands slammed against the table with theatrical precision, drawing startled glances and murmurs from her peers. This country's classrooms are being hijacked by radical ideologues who think gender is a costume and morality is optional. Her eyes scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield, locking on to anyone who so much as flinched. "Our schools used to teach math, science, and reading. Now they teach our kids to question whether they're even boys or girls. This bill will stop that." A few aides clapped quietly. Others just stared. The line had been drawn, and Greene made sure everyone knew which side she stood on. Across the room, seated in a poised stillness that looked almost rehearsed, was Representative Jasmine Crockett. Known for her sharp intellect and a courtroom presence honed long before politics, she said nothing, for now. But those who'd seen her in action knew. When Crockett was silent, it only meant she was loading her arsenal. But Greene wasn't finished, not even close. The moment her last sentence hit the ground, she pivoted with the precision of someone rehearsed in outrage, summoning a staffer like a general calling for ammunition. He handed her a thick binder, red, overstuffed, edges fraying from overuse, marked Evidence, Radical Curriculum. She threw it open, yanked out a laminated photo, and held it high above her head like a weapon. This, she declared, was proudly displayed in a 2nd-grade classroom in Illinois. The photo showed a cartoon drawing of 2 boys holding hands under a rainbow flag. "They call it inclusivity. I call it sexual grooming of minors." Gasps burst out across the room, not from shock at the image, but from the venom Greene injected into her voice. She slapped the photo down on the table with a crack, and without missing a beat, pulled out another. This one, a screenshot from a school presentation slide about gender identity. This was shown to 10-year-olds. "They want your kids to pick pronouns before they can do multiplication tables." Her pace accelerated. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a public execution of truth. She brandished a printout of a drag queen reading to children at a library, but cropped it tight, black and white, eerie in its distortion. "This is happening on your watch," she snarled, "in your communities." She began quoting statistics without context. A 74% rise in gender confusion, 38% spike in anxiety linked to identity politics, all pulled from fringe blogs and debunked think tanks. Her sources were paper thin, but her delivery was ironclad. She didn't pause for questions. She didn't allow space for nuance. Her goal wasn't to convince, it was to terrify. As Greene's voice rose into a crescendo of fury, the room tilted on its moral axis. But not everyone swayed. Jasmine Crockett sat still as stone, her chin slightly dipped, eyes locked on a blank notepad like it held the key to her restraint. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Her expression was unreadable, calm on the surface, but the kind of calm that comes before a storm rearranges the sky. To an outsider, she might have looked disengaged, even bored, but anyone who had watched her in court, who had seen her dissect lies like a surgeon wielding truth, knew exactly what this silence meant. She was absorbing, calculating, coiling like a spring. Every distorted image Greene threw, Every half-truth she screamed into the microphones added another layer of quiet fury beneath Crockett's composed exterior. It wasn't just the cruelty that stung, it was the smug certainty that no one would challenge it, that truth would sit handcuffed in the corner while fear strutted with a spotlight. And that, the injustice of watching pain paraded as policy, was what Crockett could not and would not allow to stand. Then came the moment that shifted the air from tense to unbearable, a single absence that said more than any speech ever could. The chair was still empty. The nameplate in front of it read Adrian Reyes, age 16, printed in bold black letters that now felt cruelly ironic, because the boy it belonged to had vanished before he ever got to speak. The microphone had already been tested, the water bottle uncapped, the stack of written remarks arranged neatly as if he'd just stepped out for a moment. But he hadn't. Adrian wasn't coming. Somewhere between the online threats calling him a monster and the anonymous messages saying they knew his hotel room, somewhere between the panic in his mother's voice and the trembling in his own hands as he tried to rehearse one more time in the mirror, Adrian made the hardest decision a 16-year-old could make, to stay silent in order to stay safe. And that silence, thick, haunted, deliberate, settled over the room like fog before a crash. It was heavy, suffocating, real. Everyone in the room felt it, even those who pretended not to. But Greene didn't stop. She leaned back in her chair with that theatrical casualness that always came before a calculated jab, and let her voice drip with disdain. "I suppose some people just don't have the backbone for real conversations," she said, pausing for effect. "Weak, in body and in morals." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were clean and sharp, delivered like a dagger slid under the ribs, quiet and deliberate. She grinned slightly, proud of the damage. A few in the chamber stifled awkward chuckles, not because it was funny, but because power had just spoken, and power demands applause, even in the face of cruelty. It didn't matter to Greene that the person she mocked was a child, or that he wasn't in the room because he was terrified of being hurt. To her, his absence was an opportunity, a vulnerability to exploit, a moment to score political points. She didn't need his story. She needed a ghost to blame. And in Adrian's silence, she found the perfect target. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett moved only her eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't shift in her seat, but her stare rose like smoke behind glass, slow, steady, unblinking. She looked at Greene, not like a colleague, but like someone dissecting the source of rot in a dying structure. Her face didn't show fury. That would have been easy. No, what Crockett radiated was something deeper, heavier, the kind of stillness that comes before lightning strikes, when the air holds its breath and the ground tenses in anticipation. Her fingers, resting calmly on her notes, tightened ever so slightly, just enough to leave a mark on the paper beneath them. Her gaze didn't waver. It counted every syllable Greene had just spoken. It traced the outline of every insult flung at a boy too afraid to walk through that door. And in that silence, Crockett wasn't just witnessing injustice, she was memorizing it, storing it, loading it into the chamber of her response. Because when truth is twisted and a child becomes a punchline, someone has to answer. And Jasmine Crockett, silent, simmering, still, was already preparing to answer, loud enough for Adrian to hear it wherever he was hiding. And just as the room seemed suspended in the ache of that empty chair, another figure rose, slowly, as if the grief he carried had settled into his bones and made every movement deliberate. He wasn't young. The gray in his beard and the lines etched into his face told you that much. His nameplate read Sergeant David Kessler, retired U.S. Marine Corps, and the medals on his lapel shimmered faintly beneath the harsh, fluorescent lights. He didn't need to introduce himself with pomp. His posture, upright but heavy, did it for him. He took a moment before speaking, steadying his breath the way a soldier might before walking into fire. "My name is David," he began, voice gravel thick. "I served 21 years in the Marines. I've seen war. I've lost brothers." A pause, a blink too long. "But nothing prepared me for the day I kicked down my own bathroom door and found my boy bleeding out in a tub." A collective stillness seized the room. "He was 16, Kessler said, voice shaking now. "He left a note on the sink that said, 'I'm sorry. I didn't want to disappoint you. I know I'm not the son you wanted.'" He stopped, hands trembling, and the silence that followed didn't ask for details. It demanded them. "You see, my son didn't overdose," he continued. "He didn't run with a gang. He didn't commit a crime. He was kind. He was brilliant. He loved animals. And the only thing he thought made him unlovable was that he liked boys instead of girls." Kessler looked straight ahead now, eyes burning into the table in front of him, as if reading off pain he had memorized line by line. "He thought I'd be ashamed, because he heard the things adults in this country say about people like him. He watched lawmakers talk about people like him as if they were a disease, and he took that into his heart like a bullet." A quiet gasp from the gallery broke through the stillness, but he didn't stop. "I've buried friends," he said, "but nothing comes close to sitting beside your son in a hospital bed, wondering if he'll ever believe he deserves to live." His voice broke, not with weakness, but with weight. "If my son had died that night, it wouldn't have been suicide," he said, softer now, but somehow even heavier. "It would have been a hate crime committed by a society that told him he was wrong for existing. And today, in this room, some of you are still telling him that. You're just using nicer words." The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was stunned, stricken. You could almost hear the shame crawl up the backs of those who still refused to look him in the eye. Kessler didn't cry. He didn't need to. His voice did all the bleeding. And in that moment, truth didn't shout. It stood tall, wearing a uniform, and dared anyone in that chamber to call it weakness. But just as the weight of Sergeant Kessler's words began to settle over the room like dust in the aftermath of a storm, Marjorie Taylor Greene leaned forward and shattered the stillness with a voice that sliced like glass. "There it is," she said, her tone laced with mock pity, eyes gleaming with performance. "This whole hearing, this whole emotional display, it's not about facts. It's about feelings. And frankly, I'm tired of pretending that feelings should dictate national policy." She paused, made sure the cameras were rolling, then dropped the line like a grenade. "The problem isn't that these kids are gay or confused or whatever label we're applauding this week. The problem is that we've stopped treating mental illness and started throwing parades for it." Her words didn't echo. They detonated. A quiet gasp from the back row, the stiffened posture of the chairwoman, a pen snapping between someone's fingers. Greene didn't flinch. She was only warming up. "We used to help kids get better," she continued, her voice rising steadily, confident and cruel. "Now we hand them flags, tell them they're heroes for being broken, and shame parents who try to raise their children with values." She pointed towards Sergeant Kessler without looking at him. "I'm not denying that man's pain. I'm denying the cause of it. The cause is a culture that celebrates dysfunction, that turns gender confusion into a trend, that tells a 12-year-old boy who likes musicals that he must be a girl." She chuckled under her breath, just once, but it was enough to twist the knife. "We're letting teenagers self-diagnose off TikTok and calling it brave. What happened to guiding them back to reality instead of feeding delusion?" She leaned back, satisfied, as if she'd delivered the final truth. But what she couldn't see, what she never seemed to see, was that truth doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just waits for someone brave enough to answer. And Jasmine Crockett was already preparing to rise. But before the smirk could settle on Greene's face, before her words could finish poisoning the air, a sharp sound cracked through the chamber. A knock, firm and deliberate. It was Jasmine Crockett. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. All she did was tap her fingers, once, twice, against the wooden table in front of her, and suddenly the room froze like it had been caught mid-breath. "I will not let that slide," she said, her voice low, steady, and sharp enough to draw blood. "Not when a grieving father just laid his soul on this table." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried like thunder through the silence Greene had left behind. "Words like yours aren't just cruel. They're dangerous. They give permission. They tell other people it's okay to mock, to dismiss, to dehumanize." Her eyes locked on Greene with a quiet fire that didn't flicker. It burned cold and controlled. "You're not calling out a problem," she said. "You're creating one. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it." There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the unmistakable feeling that something had shifted because someone finally dared to push back with purpose. And as the last echoes of her warning faded, Crockett leaned forward, not to raise her voice, not to spar, but to place something raw and real into the room. Not an argument, a memory, a wound that never healed. "There was a child," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that pulled every ear closer. 14 years old, quiet kid, always wore the same hoodie with a little frayed string on the sleeve. He liked drawing superheroes, said he wanted to be a firefighter one day. Her eyes didn't blink. He also liked boys. The words didn't ring with drama. They just existed, heavy, quiet, and brutally simple. And for that, just for that, his parents thought he needed help. So they sent him away, not to school, not to a summer camp, to a place that called itself therapy. But what they really meant was conversion, correction, shame. She paused, not for effect, but because remembering it still hurt. He didn't run away. He didn't lash out. He just stopped smiling. And then one day he stopped coming home. Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it got softer, more dangerous in its control. 3 months later, they found him face down by a riverbank. The coroner said the water had taken most of him, but there was one thing they still recognized, a bracelet, one of those plastic ones that said, "Be brave." He used to wear it every day. The room had gone still. No more note-taking, no more murmurs, just the sound of someone breathing too loud 2 rows back, trying not to cry. Crockett looked up, her face unreadable. "I'm not here to give you a sad story," she said. "This isn't about pulling heartstrings. This is about what happens when we act like a child's identity is a disease. When we treat difference like something to be beaten out or prayed away. That boy didn't die because he was gay. He died because people kept telling him that being gay meant he couldn't be loved, that it made him wrong, unworthy, disposable." She let the words hang there, untouched. "You think this is about protecting kids?" she added, voice sharp now, like the edge of something sacred. "But what you're really doing is teaching them to hate themselves, quietly, slowly, until one day they don't come back, and their parents are left wondering why the world feels so empty." She wasn't crying, but her stillness carried a grief deeper than tears. "I don't need to name him," she finished, "because every kid like him already knows his story. They live it, they survive it, or they don't. And what we do here decides how many more don't." And as Crockett's final words settled into the stunned silence of the room like dust after a collapse, Greene straightened in her chair, voice primed, smile tight, eyes lit with defiance. "We don't hate anyone," she said, her voice sharp and performative, echoing slightly in the chamber. "Let's be clear. This isn't about hate. This is about protecting children from dangerous ideologies." She waved one hand, as if sweeping Crockett's grief off the table. From confusion, from being told lies about who they are before they're even old enough to spell it. Her words came fast, rehearsed, like a firewall of slogans she had used too many times to count. "We're not punishing these kids, we're saving them. Because the truth is, children need structure, not experiments. They need guidance, not activism." A few heads nodded on her side, but not with confidence, with obligation. "We're not silencing anyone," Greene continued. "We're just drawing a line before confusion becomes identity, and identity becomes tragedy." But Crockett didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even raise her voice. She just leaned in, slow, deliberate, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to brace itself. Then she asked calmly but with steel in every word, "Then tell me, how many children have died from that kind of protection?" The question didn't echo. It landed, hard, a thud of truth too heavy to lift. How many kids have been told they're broken, sent away, beaten into silence, and buried under the name of protection? Her eyes never left Greene's. "You say you're saving them, but all I see are coffins filled with shame, and parents too late to understand that love doesn't look like fear. Crockett didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. After her last question landed like a stone on glass, she calmly reached into the folder resting in front of her, pulled out a printed page, and flattened it against the table with the quiet focus of someone handling something sacred. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It was steady, clear, unwavering, like someone reading a verdict aloud. "This is from the CDC," she said, lifting the page just slightly, letting the weight of the source settle into the room. "The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, not a blog, not an opinion piece, a national health agency." She paused just long enough for everyone to realize she wasn't giving a speech. She was reading a fact. "LGBTQ plus youth," she continued, "are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers." Her eyes didn't leave the page. 4 times. That means out of every 100 kids who feel safe in their identity, there are 100 more who carry a silent war in their chest, just for being different. She slowly looked up then, not to grandstand, but to look at each face one by one. And it's not because they're confused. It's not because they're broken. It's not because they're weak. Her voice softened, but somehow it hit even harder. It's because they're told over and over again that who they are makes them less worthy of safety, less worthy of love, that their truth is a threat that needs to be corrected or hidden or punished. Her hands rested flat on the table now, grounding her, holding her steady. "We don't talk kids into suicide," she said. "We shame them into it, with silence, with sermons, with bills dressed up like protection, but written in fear." The chamber was still. No chair creaked. No pen clicked. No rebuttal came. Because in that moment, it wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. Her words sat in the air like smoke after fire. Visible, lingering, impossible to ignore. No one spoke. Because no one could argue with numbers carved into headstones. And just as the silence left in the wake of the CDC statistics began to settle over the room like a heavy fog, Jasmine Crockett moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a calm that signaled something was coming. Something sharp, something prepared. She reached into a plain, gray folder tucked just beneath her stack of notes. No label, no headline, just paper and proof. "Since we're all pretending this is about protecting values," she said, her voice low but steady, "let's talk about what's really happening behind the scenes." She held up a document, 3 pages stapled together, the kind of ordinary-looking thing that only becomes dangerous when you actually read it. "This is a string of emails," she said, eyes scanning the room. "Internal communications between a well-known lobbying group that pushes anti-LGBTQ plus legislation and several large corporations who, in public, wave pride flags, but behind closed doors, write checks to silence the very people they pretend to support." The room began to shift, not in movement, but in mood. Greene adjusted in her seat. Crockett flipped to the second page. "In these emails," she continued, "the group asks for donations to help restore moral clarity in classrooms. But just 2 lines later, they talk about organizing a boycott campaign targeting brands that celebrate or normalize homosexual lifestyles." Her voice didn't rise, but her words hit like slow, precise hammer strikes. Then came the last page. "And on this email, right here, CC'd on a reply thread discussing these coordinated efforts, is the name of your senior policy aide, Representative Greene." Greene blinked, just once, but the air caught it. She opened her mouth, but Crockett was faster. "Don't deny it," she said, sliding the paper across the table, her finger pointing directly to the name highlighted in yellow. "We're not talking about distant alliances or vague associations. This is your team, your people, sitting in backroom meetings, helping organize hate in the morning, and tweeting about faith and family by night." She let that hang. No flourish, just fact. "So when you sit here and say this is about protecting children," Crockett added, "understand what some of us hear. We hear the money talking, we see the machinery moving, and now, so does everyone else." No one said a word, because there was nothing left to argue, just names, emails, and a truth too real to deny. And after laying the evidence bare, names, emails, paper trails, Crockett didn't pause for effect. She didn't wait for a reaction. She simply shifted, seamlessly, into something even heavier. The part that couldn't be printed on paper or captured in a headline. The part that lives in silence. Her voice dropped, not from hesitation, but from reverence. It was no longer the tone of a congresswoman defending a cause. It was the voice of someone carrying the weight of stories too often buried, too often brushed aside. "We talk a lot about the loud moments," she said, eyes steady, scanning the room. "The protests, the rallies, the outrage. But I want to speak about the quiet ones, the ones that don't make it to these tables." Her fingers interlocked on the desk, her shoulders still. "I want to talk about the people who live their whole lives in silence, because the truth about who they are never felt safe enough to say out loud." She took a breath, not to compose herself, but to give those words the space they deserved. "There's a man in my district, 67 years old, grew up working his father's farm, went to church every Sunday, served in Vietnam. He told me once, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, that he's never kissed someone he loved, never held their hand in daylight. Because where he's from, that would have cost him everything. His home, his church, his name." Her eyes drifted for just a second, then locked back in. "Do you know what it means to live a whole life and never be allowed to love without fear? Not just being judged, but being erased." Crockett leaned in slightly, her voice just above a whisper, yet every word carried. "There are couples who've been together for 30 years and still refer to each other as roommates when the neighbors are around. Not because they're ashamed, but because they remember the time someone had a brick thrown through their window for less." Her words weren't dramatic, they were deliberate. There are students, smart, kind, full of questions, who don't raise their hands in class, not because they don't know the answer, but because they don't even know how to ask the question that's living inside them. Her voice grew quieter, not weaker, like someone reading a letter they never meant to send. "I had a teacher tell me once that she gets anonymous notes slipped under her door, from kids, 12, 13 years old, asking, 'Am I broken? Will I go to hell? Who am I, miss?'" Her hands stayed still, but the tremble in her voice spoke volumes. These aren't abstract debates to them. These are lifelines. These are their truths whispered into cracks in the system because the world taught them to be afraid of their own reflection. She looked directly at the committee then, not with defiance, but with something much harder to carry: clarity. "And yet here we are," she said, "passing laws to make their world smaller, their silence louder, their questions dangerous." Her tone sharpened, not loud, but unrelenting. "We call it parental rights. We call it moral clarity. But really it's just another way of saying, not in front of me. Another way of telling these kids to shrink, to hide, to disappear so we don't have to be uncomfortable." Crockett didn't break eye contact. She didn't blink. "This isn't just about LGBT plus youth. This is about every person who's been told to edit themselves to survive. Every person who's looked around a room and asked, if they knew who I really was, would they still shake my hand? Would they still sit next to me in church? Would they still call me their son?" Her voice cracked, not out of weakness, but from the force of holding it all together. And the answer, too often, is no. Not because something's wrong with them, but because something's broken in us. She leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch, not for drama, but because sometimes the only way to honor pain is to let it be heard without interruption. "We are not losing children to identity," she said, her voice flat and clear. "We are losing them to isolation, to shame, to policies that tell them, you do not belong here." She inhaled through her nose, slow and deep. "And you know what hurts the most? It's not even the hate, it's the pretending. The way this country smiles and talks about freedom while forcing people to live like ghosts." Crockett placed both hands on the table, firm now, like someone anchoring herself. "You say you're protecting children, but the ones you say you're protecting are the ones who already feel safe. It's the others, the quiet ones, the scared ones, the ones who write letters they'll never send, who are asking us to protect them too. And all we give them is silence." Her jaw clenched slightly. Well, not today. Not while I'm sitting here. I won't let the quiet ones be forgotten. I won't let their questions go unanswered. The room didn't move. No one interrupted. Because in that moment it became clear, Crockett wasn't speaking to score points. She wasn't speaking to win an argument. She was speaking like someone who had carried these stories in her chest for years, too long, and finally let them breathe. And even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny it. Truth had just walked into the room, not screaming, not preaching, but speaking like it knew exactly where the pain lived. And after speaking for those who never got the chance to speak for themselves, after lifting stories out of the silence and laying them bare on the table for everyone to see, Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice for a grand finale. She lowered it. She let it settle, let it strike deeper. Because what came next wasn't rhetoric. It was the truth most people are too afraid to say aloud. If you truly want to protect children, she said, her voice steady but slow, like every syllable carried weight that couldn't be rushed, then start by not teaching them to hate themselves. The sentence didn't just hang, it landed hard, like the kind of truth that knocks the air out of your lungs before your mind catches up. You think this is about keeping them safe, she continued, gaze sweeping the chamber. But safety isn't silence. It isn't shame. It's not forcing a child to walk through life pretending their heart doesn't beat the way it was born to. Her hands rested gently on the desk, but the firmness in her tone said she wasn't asking for agreement. She was stating a fact that couldn't be negotiated. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to pull the room closer. You dress it up in morality, in tradition, in what's best for the family, but when you strip it all away, all that's left is fear. Fear of what's unfamiliar. Fear of what you can't control. Fear of the kind of love that doesn't ask for permission. Her words were clear, but they held something heavier than conviction. They held memory. Lived experience. Not necessarily hers, but carried for all the people who couldn't be in that room to carry it themselves. And every time you pass one of these, Bill, she said, voice tightening like a knot being pulled, you tell those kids, those quiet, scared, searching kids, that the world only has room for the version of them that doesn't really exist. Then without flinching, without blinking, she turned her full attention toward the woman seated across from her. Crockett's body barely moved, but her presence shifted like a storm settling into place. She looked directly at Marjorie Taylor Greene. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with clarity so sharp it could draw blood. You're not afraid of what's broken, she said, the words low but undeniable. You're afraid of what's different. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The force wasn't in volume, it was in truth. You're not scared of danger. You're scared of a world you don't get to shape in your image. You're scared of kids growing up and realizing they don't have to shrink to fit into your comfort zone? For the first time all day, Greene didn't respond. She didn't reach for her microphone, didn't roll her eyes, didn't lean back with one of her signature smirks. She just sat there, still, stone-faced, silent. And it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from poise. It was the kind that comes when someone knows there is no safe reply. No line rehearsed enough. No sentence strong enough to stand up to what was just said. Crockett didn't move either. She stayed where she was, letting the silence stretch. Not to gloat, but to let the truth breathe. Because that moment wasn't for the people in the chamber. It was for the ones watching from kitchen tables in small towns. For the teenagers hiding who they are in school hallways. For the adults who never got to say it out loud. It was for them. And every second of Greene's silence was proof that even the loudest voices can be disarmed by something real. You say you want to protect them, Crockett said again, softer now but no less sharp. But protection that only applies to some is not protection. It's preference. And you don't get to call it love when it only shows up for the kids who never had to be brave just to be seen. Still, Greene said nothing. She shifted slightly, eyes flickering, but voice absent. And the room felt it. The turn, the balance shifting. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with a woman who walked in carrying stories that weren't hers, told them as if they were, and left power staring at its own reflection with nothing left to say. And while the silence in the chamber spoke louder than any closing gavel, the world outside didn't wait. The moment left that room, and it didn't crawl, it flew. The clip hit the internet within hours. Unedited, unfiltered, just raw footage of a woman speaking like the world was on fire, and only truth could put it out. Some called her a hero, some called her dangerous. The headlines were divided, the talking heads louder than ever. Comment sections boiled over, praise and fury, tears and venom, every opinion sharper than the last. But something was different this time. The noise didn't drown out the meaning. The viral moment didn't vanish like all the others. Because somewhere beneath the algorithms and autoplay outrage, the story pierced through in places the news never reached. In a small town outside Lafayette, Louisiana, too small for pride parades, too proud for quiet rebellion, a boy sat on the edge of his bed, holding his phone with both hands like it might fall if he blinked too hard. 14 years old, thin frame, hair that curled a little too much for the boys at school to let go unmocked. His name doesn't matter here. Not because it's unimportant, but because he could be anyone. That night he watched the clip in secret, earbuds in, bedroom door locked, blanket pulled up to his chin like armor. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just stared at the screen as Jasmine Crockett's voice poured into him like something sacred. She wasn't speaking to him, not directly, but every word felt carved from his own life. The things she said, the questions he'd whispered into pillows, the shame he'd folded into silence, were suddenly there, on screen, spoken out loud by someone who looked nothing like him, but knew him anyway. He didn't move. He didn't say a word to his mother, who was doing dishes just down the hall. But later that night, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once. Quiet, like the way courage sometimes tiptoes in before it roars. The next morning, he stepped out the front door without the usual mask. No oversized hoodie, no baseball cap pulled low to hide his face. He didn't try to walk like the other boys. He didn't lower his eyes, he just walked, as himself, for the first time. Not flamboyant, not dramatic, just honest. Just there. And in a place where honesty could still get you cornered at the bus stop or side-eyed at church. That small act was nothing short of revolutionary. His mother noticed. She always noticed. She didn't say anything at first. Just watched him walk across the front lawn like he wasn't waiting for the world to collapse. And later that night, while he was in bed, she sat in her car, parked in the driveway under a quiet sky, and left a voicemail on Jasmine Crockett's office line. Her voice shook as she spoke, not from nerves, but from the weight of something that had been sitting in her chest for years. She said, "Congresswoman Crockett, my son watched your hearing today." He didn't say a word after, just stared at his phone, then at the floor. And then he hugged me. There was a pause, long and trembling. You could hear her trying to keep it together, even through a recording. He said, "Mama, I think I still deserve to be alive." Her breath caught. "And you didn't even know his name, but you gave him something I couldn't. You gave him permission to exist, to stop apologizing for breathing." Her voice cracked again. "Thank you. That's all. Just thank you." She didn't expect anyone to call her back. She didn't need them to, because what mattered most had already happened. Her son had taken one step closer to the world without armor, and she'd watched it happen. Not with a campaign, not with a protest sign, but with words spoken in a room he'd never enter by a woman who'd never met him. Meanwhile, across the country, the clip continued to move. Through phones passed under desks in classrooms, through text messages that said, "Watch this," through teachers who hit pause on their lesson plans and played something more important. It moved like a secret that had waited too long to be told. And in homes, in bedrooms, in churches, in school cafeterias, in lonely apartments and crowded buses, it did the one thing politics rarely does. It made people feel seen. But not everyone celebrated. For every mother wiping her eyes in a parked car, there was a senator calling it emotional manipulation. For every kid who sat up straighter the next morning, there was a headline branding Crockett as radical. But what none of them could deny, what no one could take back, was the echo she had left behind. It was in the way silence no longer felt safe for some, in the way parents started asking questions they used to avoid, In the way, one boy in Louisiana dared to take off his hoodie and walk into the world without asking for forgiveness. That's what truth does when it's spoken without apology. It doesn't just break through the noise, it reshapes the silence. And sometimes all it takes is one voice in the right room at the right time to remind someone, somewhere, that they still matter, that they're not alone, that they're still here and still worthy of being here. And somewhere in a congressional office hundreds of miles away, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, listening to that voicemail in her earbuds after everyone else had gone home. She didn't respond, didn't draft a tweet. She just sat there for a while, staring at her own reflection in the dark window, thinking about that boy, that mother, and how in all the noise of power and policy and politics, a single sentence, "I think I still deserve to be alive," was worth more than every headline in the world. It didn't happen all at once. There was no explosion, no breaking news headline, no rally that shut down the streets, no fireworks, no protests that trended on hashtags. What happened after Jasmine Crockett spoke was quieter than that, slower, but far more dangerous for the people who rely on silence to stay in control. Because silence didn't just vanish, it began to crack. The clip from the hearing spread like a storm cloud moving across the country. Not with thunder, but with pressure. The kind of pressure that builds until something gives. It wasn't just the moment she challenged Greene. It wasn't just the line about teaching kids not to hate themselves. It was the entire truth, calm, unflinching, unbought, spoken in a place where performance usually overpowers principle. People didn't just watch the video, they felt it. And when something makes you feel, really feel, you don't forget it the next day. You carry it with you, and it changes things. In a small library just outside Wichita, Kansas, a woman in her 60s watched the clip on her work computer. She didn't have social media. She didn't even know who Crockett was before that day. But when she heard the part about the boy who had never kissed someone he loved, she stood up from her desk and walked to the children's section. She quietly pulled down a book with two moms on the cover, a book she'd taken off the shelf 3 months earlier after a parent complained. She placed it back. No announcement, no permission, just one small rebellion, long overdue. In a high school teacher's lounge in rural Ohio, a science teacher slid her phone across the table to her colleague, a history teacher who had always avoided political stuff. "Just watch this," she said. He did. 3 times. Then later that week, he added a new section to his unit on civil rights. He didn't say it was about LGBTQ plus history. He didn't label it. But the kids knew. They always know. And when a shy girl in the back stayed after class and said, "Thanks," he just nodded. He didn't need her to explain. In a diner in Oklahoma, a man in his late 40s, a mechanic who had never once spoken publicly about his own teenage years, watched the clip on Facebook while waiting for his breakfast order. He stared at the screen like it was speaking directly to him. When the waitress came by, he wiped his eyes quickly and muttered something about allergies. But that night, he told his wife for the first time about the boy he'd loved when he was 17. The boy he never kissed. The boy who moved away. The boy whose name he never stopped remembering. And the most radical part? No one organized any of this. No movement claimed it. No party banner flew over it. It was just people. Ordinary, everyday people, sitting in the quiet corners of America, feeling something crack open inside them. Because what Jasmine Crockett said wasn't just about policy, it was about memory, about lives half-lived in silence, about all the times someone almost spoke, but didn't. And when she named that silence out loud, something ancient in people stirred. Not rage, not defiance, just the ache of being seen after so long in the dark. Somewhere in North Carolina, a retired Baptist pastor wrote a letter he never thought he'd write. It wasn't political. It wasn't even long. It just said, "I preached a lot of fire, but I never preached grace to the ones who needed it most. I watched your clip. I don't know what I believe anymore, but I know I was wrong." In Arizona, a young father, conservative his whole life, paused the clip halfway through. He didn't agree with everything. He wasn't ready for that. But later that night, when his 8-year-old son asked, "Dad, what does it mean if I like pink more than blue?" He didn't snap. He didn't deflect. He just said, "It means you like pink, buddy." "That's okay." Then he went into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter for 20 minutes, breathing through something he didn't yet know how to name. This wasn't a wave. It wasn't a movement. It was a shift, a deep one that moved through the bones of people, not their timelines. It moved through guilt, through memory, through years of pretending not to know what was obvious. It moved through fathers who had never apologized, through mothers who had prayed their child wouldn't come out, through teachers who had edited their words, through coaches who had laughed at the wrong jokes, through churches, through dinner tables, through mirrors. And as it moved, people started to speak, not loudly but honestly. A woman in Montana called into a local radio station during a segment on woke education. Her voice shook. "I'm not political," she said, "but I watched that congresswoman talk, and it reminded me of my sister. She died in 1994. Nobody in our family ever said she was gay, but she was, and I wish I had said it out loud while she was alive." A trans teenager in Idaho showed the clip to their older brother, someone who had teased them their whole life. The brother didn't say much, just sat there watching it, then nodded and said, "She's tough. I like her." The next morning, for the first time ever, he told their mom to call them by the name they chose. No speech, no apology, just one brick taken out of a wall that had been built for years. The truth is, it's not the big moments that change us. It's the small ones that sneak in after. The way someone speaks to their child, the way a teacher looks at a student who's too scared to raise their hand, the way a parent rewrites the voice in their head. What Jasmine Crockett did in that room, it didn't end when the cameras stopped. It began. It spilled out and seeped into cracks no policy had ever reached. Even Greene, for all her bluster, started shifting. Not in her words, but in the way she said them. The next time she tried to invoke protecting children, her voice caught just a little. Just enough for people to notice. Because when truth moves through a country like that, it doesn't need to win arguments. It only needs to be remembered. And it was remembered in every classroom where a kid exhaled a little deeper. In every kitchen where a parent chose to listen instead of react. In every bathroom where someone stared in the mirror and didn't flinch. That's where it lived now. Not in laws, not in clips, but in people. Because the silence didn't break in one big shatter. It cracked and kept cracking. One voice at a time. One step at a time. One truth at a time. Weeks passed. The headlines shifted. New scandals broke. New hearings erupted. The world, always hungry for something louder, turned its gaze elsewhere. But in the background, like a melody that refuses to be drowned out, the truth lingered. Jasmine Crockett's speech had come and gone from the news cycle. The clip had made its rounds. The reaction videos were already old. On paper, it was over. But the strange thing about truth, the kind that isn't performance, the kind that's lived, not delivered, is that it doesn't need to stay loud to stay alive. It just needs to be held. Her staff noticed it first, not in retweets or press inquiries, but in the mail. Not email, not DMS, real mail, letters, envelopes with stamps, folded notebook paper, lined with the handwriting of people who weren't looking to go viral, people who just wanted to say something they'd never had a place to say before. They came from every corner of the country, red states, blue states, towns so small they didn't show up on Google Maps. No formal greetings, just lines like, "I've never told anyone this before. I didn't cry when my son came out, but I did when I watched you speak. You don't know me, but I think you would have loved my daughter." Crockett didn't display the letters. She didn't read them into the record. She didn't turn them into talking points. Instead, she opened them slowly, alone, usually at the end of the day. Sometimes after everyone else had gone home, when the building echoed with that peculiar silence only power can produce. The kind that still feels like someone's watching, even when no one is. She kept the letters in a plain brown box in the corner of her office. No lock, no label. Just one small phrase handwritten in black ink across the top. Keep going. It wasn't activism. It wasn't politics. It was personal. Because the people writing to her weren't just reacting to what she said. They were confessing what they had been holding for years. Regret, grief, fear, hope. They weren't asking for legislation. They were asking to be believed. And Crockett, who had come to Congress as a former public defender, not a politician, understood that weight better than most. Sometimes people don't want a champion. They want a witness, someone who won't look away, someone who won't make their story smaller than it is. And that's what her words had done. They hadn't erased pain. They hadn't fixed anything. They had simply said, I see it. I see you. Somewhere in Texas, a woman named Angie placed her letter in the mailbox with shaking hands. She hadn't written anything by hand in years. Her penmanship looked like someone trying not to cry. In her letter, she wrote about her daughter, Rebecca, who had come out at 15 and died by suicide at 17. She didn't blame anyone, didn't name names. But in one paragraph she wrote, I watched your hearing and wished to God someone had said those words while she was still alive. Maybe then she wouldn't have thought she had to disappear to be loved. That letter never went viral, but it lived. It lived in Crockett's hands. It lived in her drawer, and it lived in every quiet moment where she sat alone, thinking not about votes or cameras, but about why she came here in the first place. Meanwhile, in a town just outside Tallahassee, a high school junior named Jordan began showing up to class with his head held higher. Nothing dramatic, just a little less hunch in his shoulders, a little more eye contact. His teachers noticed. So did his mother. When she asked what had changed, he didn't say much, just shrugged and said, I don't know. I just feel like someone said what I've been thinking for a long time. In moments like these, Crockett began to realize something that changed how she saw the work entirely. Truth isn't measured by volume. It's measured by what survives after the noise. And while others chased the headlines, Greene included, still shouting on late-night panels, still pushing fear packaged as concern, Crockett stayed focused. Not on what looked powerful, but on what felt real. Her next hearing wasn't viral. It wasn't fiery. It didn't trend. But when a bill came forward proposing new restrictions on curriculum related to gender identity, she didn't raise her voice. She just quietly placed a copy of the CDC report in front of the microphone and said, I'd like to enter this into the record. No speech, no soundbite, just a document backed by science, placed with the calm confidence of someone who knows the truth doesn't need to scream. And even then, even in those quiet hearings no one watches, the energy had changed. Her Republican colleagues didn't interrupt as much. The laughter had quieted. The tension had shifted. Because whether they admitted it or not, they'd all seen the clip. They'd seen what happened when someone called cruelty what it is. And more importantly, they'd seen how people outside these walls responded. Not with riots, with reflection. That's what made it dangerous. Because the truth, spoken calmly, carried carefully, does something fear never can. It gives people a mirror. And while you can scream over a protest, you can't unsee your own reflection once you've looked into it. Back in her office one evening, as the sun dipped below the Capitol dome, Crockett sat with another letter in her lap. This one came from a young man in Utah, 22 years old, grew up Mormon, left home at 18, came out at 20. In his letter, he wrote, I didn't think anyone in Congress even knew people like me existed. You didn't just speak for me. You reminded me I wasn't crazy for wanting to be whole. You didn't give me a law. You gave me space. She folded the letter slowly and placed it in the box with the others. No applause, no camera. Just a quiet moment between her and a truth that didn't need to be performed to matter. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need a microphone. It just needs to be held long enough for someone else to pick it up and carry it forward. And as Crockett folded that final letter and slipped it into the box labeled "Keep Going," she wasn't thinking about headlines. She wasn't thinking about her next hearing, her next vote, or the next interview someone would beg her to take. She was thinking about one thing and one thing only. What it means to carry a voice that wasn't supposed to be heard. Because that's the thing about truth. When it finally gets said, clearly, simply, without apology, it doesn't disappear. It echoes. It grows. And if you listen carefully, you realize the echo never belonged to just one person. It belongs to everyone who needed to hear it and never got the chance. It becomes theirs. It becomes ours. The story was never just about a hearing. It wasn't even just about LGBTQ plus rights, though that was the battleground. The real story, the one that traveled silently through classrooms, libraries, and broken dinner tables, was about a larger war. A war between shame and visibility, between fear and honesty, between silence and voice. The lesson? It's not that Crockett had better words. It's that she refused to shrink when it would have been safer to say nothing at all. She stood in a room built to intimidate and spoke like it was her grandmother's kitchen table, like she was talking to family. And that's why it hit. That's why it stuck. Because the people listening, really listening, weren't policy wonks or consultants or donors. They were parents, teachers, closeted teens, exhausted allies. People who have spent their lives asking a question so raw, it barely fits into words. Do I still belong in a world that tells me I'm wrong just for existing? Crockett didn't give them a perfect answer, but she gave them a reply. And in a world that tries to turn lives into numbers and identities into agendas, that reply meant everything. Because the truth is, most people don't want to fight. Most people just want to live. They want to go to school without wondering if they'll be erased from the lesson plan. They want to go to church without pretending there's someone else in the pew. They want to tell their parents who they are without having to pack a bag just in case it goes wrong. They want to walk down the street holding the hand of the person they love without scanning the crowd for danger. They want to wake up in the morning and believe, really believe, that being themselves won't cost them everything. And yet that's still too much to ask in too many places. We've built a culture that tells children, be yourself, then passes laws that punish them for it. We call it protection, but what we're really protecting is the comfort of those who never had to question their own reflection. And every time a bill passes that tries to make someone disappear, every time a curriculum is stripped, every time a book is banned, every time a law uses the word morality to disguise cruelty, what we're really saying is, we'd rather have silence than discomfort. We'd rather have shame than change. But Crockett, in that moment, chose differently. She chose discomfort. She chose to make the room uneasy. And the lesson there, so painfully simple, is that sometimes justice doesn't start with shouting. It starts with not flinching. She didn't flinch when a grieving father spoke about his gay son trying to take his own life. She didn't flinch when Greene smirked and called identity a mental illness. She didn't flinch when the hearing turned into theater. She just waited. And when the moment came, she cut through the noise with something louder than a scream: clarity. And it worked. Not because it went viral, but because it stuck. In the minds of people who never cared before, in the hearts of people who thought they were alone, and in the bodies of people who woke up the next morning a little less afraid of their own skin. That's what makes this story matter. Not that it was dramatic, but that it was true. We live in a world that values loudness over truth, speed over depth, certainty over empathy. But truth, real truth, it's rarely loud. It shows up in whispers, in glances, in quiet moments when someone decides not to hide anymore. When a teacher pulls a student aside after class. When a father finally listens instead of interrupts. When a church door stays open even after someone tells them to close it. And the greatest truth of all, you don't need a microphone to make a difference. You just need to hold someone's story long enough for them to believe it matters. That's the human lesson underneath the noise. We are not saved by speeches. We are saved by being seen. So what does it mean to protect children, really? It means we protect their joy, their safety, their truth. It means we teach them they don't have to trade pieces of themselves for belonging. It means we don't confuse discipline with erasure or faith with fear. It means we love them loudly, even when the world around them demands they be small. What Crockett said in that hearing wasn't revolutionary because it was new. It was revolutionary because it was honest. And honesty in politics is the rarest form of rebellion. And so, the lesson we're left with isn't complex. It's not even political. It's heartbreakingly simple. Tell the truth, even when it shakes the room. Protect the vulnerable, even when it costs you something. Listen, really listen, to the stories people are afraid to tell. Because the cost of ignoring them is too high. It's paid in hospital beds and missing children and mothers crying into voicemail recordings. It's paid in generations that never got to be whole. It's paid in silence so loud it becomes unbearable. But if we choose differently, if we choose to listen, to hold, to protect, the reward is far greater. It's in the boy who walks down the street in Louisiana for the first time as himself. It's in the mother who holds him and says, "You are enough." It's in the teacher who posts a quote on the wall and waits for the first kid to say, "That helped me." It's in every story that gets to keep going because someone, somewhere, chose to speak the truth and refused to let it go. Truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone brave enough to carry it, and Jasmine Crockett did. So now the question is, will we? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.